Afternoon, and a very pleasant good morning and good evening, wherever you're located and whatever time zone you're at. This is your hour, and this is Rita Gadi. I'm having some technical problems hearing our studio, the Katipunan and Demokratikong Pilipino, but somehow we are getting connected as best as we can. And so this is a greeting coming from San Juan City in Metro Manila, where here in our country we are reaching 8,000 cases of this COVID-19 virus a day. But over the past year and over the past months of this new year, it's already the first quarter. As a matter of fact, about to complete the first quarter of 2021. Just about everything that everyone is talking about is involving the virus, the variant, the contamination, the vaccine that is slowly arriving and slowly being distributed and given to people who are needing this in the priority list. And so let's take a break. And I'd like to gather just some portions of a past and bring it now to the present so that it can be remembered for the future. Episode of a past which hardly anyone has ever talked about or at all, just briefly. But this is to give some kind of a respite from all of the talks and headlines and newspaper accounts and everything else that you can hear, both from the news coming from abroad and the news coming from our country. It's all about this virus. And then, of course, the vaccine that everybody's anticipating. But the bottom line there is that virus will be here for quite some time, the way other viruses also just float about the air. But this is some kind of an albatross because it has affected people's lives quite seriously and, of course, our economy. So let's take a break. As I have said earlier, I am gathering portions of a past so that I can bring it back to the future and as I discuss it now for the present. But why is this necessary? Well, so that we can at least understand that somewhere in time, some personalities have been part of our contemporary history. And so, whatever it is that we're going through right now, perhaps if we listen to many of these things that have happened then in that particular period, we may be able to understand how human suffering is and how the sufferance is something that we can get over on a day to day basis. What am I referring to? Well, just recently, somebody posted a photograph on Facebook, and I had something like, well, it was a photograph of Willie Avila, photographer, artist, and myself. I was looking somewhere. Willie was looking directly at whoever was taking our photograph. And at the background, you could see some vehicles and some buildings. And a lot of comments came after that. And so I'd like to explain further why there was this photograph and all the reactions that came after it. The reactions were, I remember New York City. Those were wonderful days. And several other comments, which of course involved the personalities that you could see there. Willie Avila, photographer and artist, and myself. Yes, that was in New York City. And that's the topic that we have this afternoon or today in this Rita Gadi hour. Let's take a break for now from the pandemic and the virus. And let me just do my best to recount that particular episode in New York City. We just came out of the subway, and the subway in Foley Square exit, which is right in front of the District Court of New York City. The District Court of New York City, where there was the trial of Imelda Romualdez Marcos for a case that was filed by the most powerful country in the world and the severest system of justice, the United States of America. Again, I repeat, the United States of America versus Ferdinand and Imelda Romualdez Marcos in the 3rd District Courthouse which was presided over by Judge John F. Keenan. And this was the celebrated RICO case. RICO stands for the United States law, which abbreviated or extended would mean racketeering influenced and corrupt practices organizations, RICO. What exactly does that mean? Well, it alleges that the government of President Ferdinand Edralin Marcos for the 20 years of his administration was a corrupt, influenced organization. The author of this law, a United States of America law, said that that law was created for the underworld, the mafia, the syndicates that was ruling New York City and several of the cities all over the United States, where you had smuggling, prostitution, corruption, several other, the sleazy Balzacian world. That's why they call it the underworld. And in order to be able to capture or to catch those criminals in this underworld, it was necessary, according to the author, that that law would be the one that will be able to capture all of them. So, if, for instance, the head of that criminal syndicate was living in a hotel or in a condominium, if there was a condominium already at the time, but living in a hotel or in a certain building, and several other members of his gang of criminals were also staying there, everybody else will be considered as a criminal. Like the way we say it, the crime of one, because it's a syndicate, the crime of one or a conspiracy is the crime of all. So the head of that group, that gang, that syndicate, encompasses the entire group, down to the bellhop, down to the valet, so everybody else. So whatever criminal acts the syndicate committed, everybody else was considered as part of that conspiracy or that syndicate. And that's exactly what the RICO was when they filed that case against President Ferdinand E. Marcos and Imelda Romualdez Marcos, that they were heading the criminal syndicate of the Philippine government, alleging that they stole the money of the Filipino people and purchased four real estate properties in New York City. And that is why that case was being tried in New York City, because the four real estates were located there. The Crown Building, 40 Wall Street, and the two other buildings. So you can imagine how this actually pictured our government as that criminal syndicate under President Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Romualdez Marcos. And so when I mentioned the photograph that showed the background of New York City, plus the background where you could see some of the pillars of the courthouse, that's exactly where we were. And that's the kind of episode that I'd like now to take a break and relate to you as best as I could, so that you will understand and perhaps be able to remember, if you could, that this is the first time that you have a foreign government trying a foreign head of state for a crime that he violated a law, an American law, calling the government of that head of state as a criminal syndicate. That was the RICO case. Ganon kabigat yung kanilang pinatong at paratang, whatever you call it, yung kanilang accusation against President and Mrs. Marcos. And that was exactly why we were there. And together with us, well, this is just to make light of everything so that we do not get too serious about it. Beside me was Willie Avila. He has been the photographer from way, way back, historically from what? From 1965? Well, he was a photographer already even prior to that, in many jobs that he held. But with the administration of President Marcos, he began the way I also began sometime in 1965, all the way up to that particular incident in New York City, which was in 1990. So together with Willie Avila, the other persons who were with us at the time, I wrote them down and I hope I don't miss out on anyone. We were all together there for that trial in that courthouse. And as I've said, that is located at Foley Square. which is very close, or just about a few blocks, 2 or 3 blocks, but you could actually see it from the buildings of the courthouse. Chinatown, New York City's Chinatown. You take the subway, go to Canal Street, and that's it. But we take the subway. Willie and I took the subway from Dag Hammarskjöld Towers. We took it from Lexington, I understand, and then that was where we surfaced right in front of the courthouse, and that's Foley Square. So together with us, of course, they were riding other vehicles. They were in a van. They were in several other cars coming from the Dag Hammarskjöld Towers, where everybody else was residing. So they well, these are the people who were there actually. Many of them all together. That's why we have called this, like, we were the survivors of all of this. We're leading the bank, the the company of Mrs. Marcos at the time in that New York courthouse was her sister, Sister Bellarmine, Superior General of the College of the Holy Spirit, who has just retired. But prior to that, she was the Superior General of the Holy Spirit College in Rome. She was based in Rome, and she was the manager and administrator, or whatever else you would call it, of the entire congregation of the Holy Spirit. Holy Ghost at the time was how it was called. So you have Holy Spirit beside Asambeda in Mendiola, Union. That is the Holy Spirit that was headed by Sister Bellarmine. Sister Bellarmine was the half sister of Mrs. Marcos from the first wife of her father. Her father was Orestes Romualdez, a lawyer and also a musician. And his first wife together with his first wife, he had 5 children, and then his wife died. And then he married Remedios Trinidad from Bulacan. And the eldest of his children from his second marriage was Imelda Romualdez. So Sister Bellarmine, who was together with Mrs. Marcos, was the older sister, half sister of Mrs. Marcos. And she would walk the steps all the way. If you've gone to New York, you would know how these courthouses, how these pillars of justice, buildings of justice look like. You had to climb several. Of course, there was an elevator on the ground floor, but she much rather take the steps, and that was where all the media were lined up, because they were not everybody was allowed to enter. There was a limited number of seats for the media that was covering the trial of Mrs. Marcos, but they were also not allowed to bring in their cameras, and they were also not allowed to bring in tape recorders. So they were lined up there on the staircase when Mrs. Marcos and her entourage, if you would call it, would be arriving, and they could they were hoping that they could do some ambush interviews, as you would call it. And Sister Bellarmine would be walking ahead of everyone else. She was escorted by Tessie Romualdez Marfori, married to Joey Marfori. May their souls rest in peace. Tessie is the first cousin of Mrs. Marcos, also the daughter of one of the brothers of her father, Vicente Romualdez. I know her from way back. Vicente Romualdez lived across us across our house in White Plains. Those of you who live in White Plains would know this. He was married to Rosita Veloso Olivar, and then they had also a multitude of children. Anyway, Tess Romualdez married Joey Marfori, and she was there in New York, and she was the aide-de-camp, so to speak, the alalay of Sister Bellarmine, her aunt. That was the relationship. So that was Sister Bellarmine. And we were also with Fortuna Marcos Barba. We called her Tita Baby. That was her nickname. She's the youngest sister of President Marcos. And she was there with him in Honolulu. And then she joined Mrs. Marcos in Hawaii. So you have two sisters. And it's the stepsister of Mrs. Marcos, Tita Baby, Fortuna Marcos Barba, married to Colonel Barba. May both their souls rest in peace. And then you had Sister Bellarmine. And then we had all the girls, or the women that accompanied Mrs. Marcos during those months of the trial. Well, we had Ileana Maramag, who was there. not every day, but as quite often. She was the press secretary of Mrs. Marcos. She belongs to a family of outstanding journalists, and she herself is a very good writer. Also, may her soul rest in peace. But that's Ileana Maramag, the press secretary of Mrs. Marcos, and then you had who else did we have there? Well, we had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was already retired. He would come all the way from outside of New York, from New Jersey. I think he took the train from Jamaica. Chief Justice Enrique Fernando. I would sometimes, oh no, not sometimes, but the first two times that he was arriving from New Jersey, I would meet him at the Penn Station and then bring him to the courthouse. So that was the Chief Justice, and in many instances, he would be conversing with the lawyers of Mrs. Marcos. So who else was with us? Well, we had Alfred Romualdez, who was taking care of our accommodations and the accommodations of Mrs. Marcos at the Dag Hammarskjöld Towers. And then we had Marichu Vera Perez Maceda. She was also part of the group that was there during the trial in New York City. Manay Icho, as we would call her. And we had so much fun with her because she had so many stories. Many of the things that were happening then when Mrs. Marcos was beginning to join the campaigns for the first term of President Marcos, 1965, when we had to pack all of those Christmas packages. Remember, the elections then in 65 were held in November, and that was a time that President Marcos was proclaimed, but he would take his oath in the following, he would be assuming office in January of the following year. But in December, already right after he won, we were already packing Christmas packages at the, maybe, I don't know what you call that place there, but it is beside the house of the old house of the Vera Perezes here in San Juan. And Mrs. Marcos was supervising the packages, Christmas packages, to be distributed to the people of, at the time, hindi pa Metro Manila, but the people of Manila, Quezon City, San Juan, and several other cities adjacent to San Juan City, because that was where they originally resided. The old Marcos home was there in the Mariano Marcos Street, which was Ortega before, and that was where he established his residence when he was a congressman. And when he married Mrs. Marcos, that was renovated to, it was expanded to be really more like a political place where you had a lot of people gathering, and that was exactly what happened then. So that was, well, who am I talking about? Yes, Ileana Maramag, and then we had Marichu Vera Perez Maceda. And then, of course, there was Conchita Rason. Conchita Rason, as you would remember, that is her maiden name, Conchita Rason. But she already had children with Louis Tabuena, and then also children with Martin Rivera. I'm sorry, Bert Rivera. Martin Rivera is her son, and twins also with Bert Rivera. So that is Conchita Rason. And as I've said, these two ladies really gave us the light moments during the trial of Mrs. Marcos. There were a lot of jokes. They always found some humor and something to laugh about, not only as they were watching the witnesses, but several instances where we were feeling so low or feeling so so sad that we were there in New York, and what is this trial all about? And Manay Ichu and Conchita always gave us their humor that really lifted our spirits. And then we also had, well, I already mentioned Tess Romualdez Marfori. We had the Monsignor Nebres, who gave us all the religious, inspirational homilies, and he also celebrated Mass as often as he was there. He was not there continuously for the 5 months that the trial was ongoing, but he would visit every once in a while and celebrated Mass for us with a special permission from the Archbishop of New York City. We also had Eden Rubio Bolante, who was married to Dr. Nell, and they resided in New Jersey, but they came also to be part of the group that assisted Mrs. Marcos during that time. She is the daughter of the Rubio that was originally the some kind of an aide-de-camp in a way to Congressman Marcos in Ilocos. Her father would drive for Congressman Ferdinand Marcos at the time. And according to President Marcos, when I interviewed him, how he was able to choose this Rubio as his driver, he said, well, he was a bus driver. And so when you're traveling from Manila to Ilocos with all the roads, etc., and you had to you had to travel fast because he had to attend Congress and then attend to his constituents in Ilocos Norte. So he needed a very good driver, and you see, he said the best of them would be a bus driver, and that was Rubio, the father of Eden Rubio. He eventually became mayor and also very prosperous eventually, and she married Dr. Bolante, also from Ilocos, and they resided in New Jersey. And so when Mrs. Marcos was there in New York for the trial, she also joined our group. Then there was Joe Barameda. You will see him now every once in a while with all of the movie stars that he is managing and so forth, and several of these teleseries that are now on air in spite of the pandemic. And Joe Barameda, I really didn't quite know where he was working then, but he was already a resident of New York City, and he introduced himself to us as he were, and told us many stories about movie actors and actresses. But what was most memorable of Joe Bar, as we would call him, was that every afternoon he would come to the courtroom and bring us these delicacies from from Chinatown, mga hopia, mga siomai, siopaw, all of this little kakanin, Chinese kakanin from Chinatown, and we really waited for him. And there was one time that, the first few times that he would be coming, Sister Bellamin would look at him and ask, "Who is this person?" And so, but when he started, distributing his hopia, siopaw, and all of this, he was one of those eagerly anticipated by Sister Bellamin. Joe Bar and several other New York residents who were there attending, not perhaps on a daily basis, but as often as they could, because many of them were working. So the court hours were from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was the only time that many of the Filipino residents of New York City would be off from work. So, but those of them, many of those who were able to get off from work, they would be joining us there at the courtroom. So that was it. Then we had Roger Paywan, who was some kind of an aide-de-camp also to Mrs. Marcos, who was the perennial, ubiquitous escort. And he was always so very well dressed, and he was attending to just about all the protocols that were needed for people who wanted to meet with Mrs. Marcos, appointments, etc. And all of that was Roger. Again, may his soul rest in peace. Ang dami nang nawala sa amin noon. Chuchi Reyes, pilot, was also one of those chief security officer, you would call it, although he was a registered pilot on his own, and really he was tall, and so it was very convenient for him to be part of the security escort of Mrs. Marcos. You must understand that this is a foreign country. New York City, although she loved New York City, it was hostile in the beginning, until when people would see her walking down the street from Dag Hammarskjöld to the church, which was about just a block away, people would be shouting at her or calling out her name and saying, "Hang on there, Mama." And that was where you see how even the ordinary people of New York City were cheering her and wanting to have a photograph with her, the way it was also when she was first in Honolulu. With all the hatred that you would read in the newspaper, especially the yellow newspapers here in our country. But if they would see how she was in Honolulu, how people would gather around her, how people would love to have, not really love, but would ask for photographs with her. She was like a mobile tourist spot. Wherever she would go, in a department store, or when she had to buy some flowers or some plants, ang dami, lahat tala-tala nagkakagulo. Everybody wanted an autograph from her. Kaya nga nauso yun eh. Wala silang papel, and they would get a pencil pen and they would have her sign on their shirts or on their clothes or their blouses or whatever, and photographs also. So anyway, sa New York, ganun din. Every time she was out on the street, sabi ko nga, the only time that she would be walking would be from Dag Hammarskjöld Towers, crossing the street and then go to church. There was a small church a block away, as a matter of fact. So pag nakikita siya ng mga taong passers-by and all of that, talagang nagpaparitrato. And I've said, not a single bad word or not a single bad exclamation. All of them were cheering her, saying, "Hang on there, Mama. We're with you, Mama," and all of this. And they called her Mama in a way. And she was at the peak of her loveliness, even as she was already in that period of great sufferance. So who else was with us? Yeah, we had Willie Avila, and that's why I'm talking about this now, because a lot of people commented on the photograph that they saw on Facebook. I think it was my daughter who posted this, and that was the two of us. And as I've said, Willie and I would take the subway to get to the courthouse there at Foley Square. And then, of course, son-in-law Greggy Araneta and Irene, they would fly from San Francisco to attend the trial every once in a while. They were not there continuously. Bongbong was there. He was also attending the trial together. But Art Ruiza, who was supposed to be a prospective witness in favor of Mrs. Marcos' case, he could not enter the courtroom kasi bawal yun eh. Kung witness ka for the defense, hindi pwede mo nang pumasok. And all the other witnesses of the prosecution, of course, were hidden somewhere else by the U.S. Justice Department. And then we had, as I already mentioned, and then visitors from Manila, Cherico Barubias, who was heading the Marcos Loyalist Group. She would come every once in a while and brought General Galileo Quintanar with her, who was a very close friend of then Secretary of Defense Reyes, Angelo Reyes. And it was through the influence and through General Galileo Quintanar that the Chief of Staff, Angelo Reyes, was able to write a statement that Mrs. Marcos did not pose any security threat to the Republic of the Philippines and should already be allowed to go home. That was several months after the trial in New York City. I even typed that particular statement that would be issued by Secretary Angelo Reyes, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, addressed to Corazon Aquino at the time. So I am saying this, as I've said, from firsthand knowledge. These are not speculations. These are not hearsay. This is exactly as it was. I was there. I wrote it. I gave it to General Quintanar. He dictated what had to be written, and he brought that piece of paper to Chief of Staff Angelo Reyes. And the witnesses there were General Quintanar himself, Cherico Barubias, Mrs. Marcos, and of course, as I've said, Angelo Reyes. Anyway, so who else was there? Marichu, I was writing there, Jobar, and of course, Rolly Parado was with the Foreign Affairs. He would have been our ambassador already at the time, but he was there also helping out with Mrs. Marcos' delegation, entourage, and he would be, together with several of the New Yorkers there. We had, I will be mentioning them as I go proceed with this. But that was the group we were with. And so you could see that we enjoyed, in a way, every day, because no matter how difficult the trial was getting to be as far as the witnesses are concerned, and all the statements and accusations being repeated almost on a daily basis, like you have this, just to mention, we had 3 members of the prosecution. There's John McInerney, and then you had Debra Livingston. She was the cruelest of them all, because she would point her finger at Mrs. Marcos just about a few centimeters close to the nose of Mrs. Marcos, and accuse her of stealing the money of the Filipino people. Every time she wanted to emphasize a point, she would point a finger. What an appropriate family name, Debra Livingstone. A Livingstone, good grief. And then you had the chief prosecutor, the handsome young man, dashing young man, so to speak. He was the one who took over Rudolph Giuliani. The name is still very familiar to many of you who live in New York and in America. Rudolph Giuliani, who was with President Trump and wanted to carry on the fight against Biden. But that was Rudolph Giuliani at the time, who was with the Justice Department and the chief prosecutor supposed to be of the trial against Imelda Marcos. But he intended to run for the city mayor of he intended to run for city mayor of New York City, using all of his previous statements against the Marcoses, which made the headlines of all the broadsheets in New York City. The last of which he said was, "I vow to bring her to jail." That was the pledge he made to New York City, that he would bring Imelda to jail. And on that ground, on that statement, he used it as part of his campaign gimmick to for the mayorship of New York City. Sadly, he lost miserably. That was Rudolph Giuliani. And the prosecutor that took over from him was this dashing young man, as I've said, who probably did not realize what he was going through as he was doing his best to prosecute Mrs. Marcos, and that was Charlie Labella, so to speak. And as I've said, he would enter the courtroom with a grocery cart because he had to use all those 350,000 documents as evidences against Mrs. Marcos. And so you had what? You had several of those files, packed all together, and no suitcase would be able to carry this, not even a suitcase for clothes. So it would be very difficult and very unnerving and very inappropriate to have a suitcase in front of your desk there as a prosecutor. So he had a grocery cart. Ganun kadami yung mga dokumento sa araw-araw na paglilitis laban kay Mrs. Marcos. Grocery cart, andun yung mga folders nila. We had all the copies of this, all 350,000 of these documents. And, we had how many? 2 rooms, which was supposed to be the offices of the lawyers, where we rented filing cabinets, and then they were all indexed. They were indexed so that pag sinabi ng prosecution na tomorrow we are going to present this witness, and this is what these are the the documents that we are going to present as evidence. So in the evening, di na talaga kami natutulog. We had to go over our files and try to locate the documents connected to that witness. And remember, there were 95 of these witnesses that were presented in court. Kaya talagang napakabigat to repeat, And the first time I heard it, talagang taas ang balahibo ko talaga. I really had the fur of my skin rising up. The court secretary, what was her name? Mary. I don't know her family name, but we all know her as Mary because the judge addressed her as such, Mary. So she was the first one that will enter the courtroom. Pag nakapasok na kami lahat, we had designated seats. We could not sit right out front. That was for the media and for the court artists kasi bawal ang photographers. So they do the sketches. Ang mahal nung kanilang sketches in charcoal, in oil, and pencil, and all of this. They would draw the picture of Imelda, the picture of the witnesses, the jury, the judge. Lahat na yung dinodrawing lang nila according to the event of the day. So sila yung nasa harapan, the front seat. And then of course, next to that you had the media. So we were on the 3rd row. Alam mo, parang sa simbahan yan parang mga pew. And then there was an aisle in the middle sa courtroom. The windows were up mataas ang ceiling. The court, we had the session started dun sa tinatawag ng jury selection. At that time, wala pang spectators. That was how they called us. Yung mga nagwi-witness nung trial, we were called the spectators. There were marshals that designated where we're supposed to sit. So nasa 3rd row kami, tapos sa likod, yung mga sari-saring tao. And then, of course, that was how it was. So magkakatabi kami. The people I mentioned, we were beside each other, except, of course, for Roger Paywan. He was somewhere at the back. Alfred Romualdez was also at the back. And then you had doctora, the physician of Mrs. Marcos there also. Pero kami, sila Mrs. Barba, si Tita Baby, Tess, Tess Marfori, and Sister Bellarmine, we were all together in that row. And every once in a while, as I've said, on the other side, we would look at the members of the media, the local media from New York City, and then the media from the Philippines. And that was where Carmen Pedrosa was really in attendance just about every day. And it is amazing, what she would write about it, which was completely, different from what was actually happening in the court. I wrote about it every day. I sent my reports to Kit Tatan, who was the editor then of one of the broadsheets here in Manila, and that was a daily journal actually of the court proceedings. Anyway, that's this is the kind of take a break that I would like to mention. But let me go back just a little bit further, because before we really started with the court proceedings, President Marcos was still alive during the indictment of Mrs. Marcos. The indictment was held in October, and the actual trial was how many months after? So the indictment was in October, and the trial began the year after. That was in March. Patay na si President Marcos. So na-indict si Mrs. Marcos noong October, and I think I tried my best to describe that particular scene when Mrs. Marcos was leaving Makiki Heights residence to proceed to the airport, and from the airport to fly to New York City. President Marcos was on a wheelchair. He was one of those that would have proceeded also to New York City, but he was already ill in a way, and he had the neck brace kasi merong, I don't know what problem there was there, and he was bidding goodbye to Mrs. Marcos there just as she was about to board the vehicle to bring her to the airport. And that was for me one of the saddest scenes that um, I wish I could forget, but it's not a wish. It is there. It is indelibly printed in my mind. He held Mrs. Marcos' hand and said that it is so sad that he could not defend her himself. He was bar top notcher, one of the best lawyers and one of the best presidents actually. And at the time when his wife Imelda was going to be indicted in New York, he could not be there. But he was also part of that criminal syndicate that America accused them of. Anyway, so then uh, that was October. He survived all throughout the following December, which is Christmas, and onwards until September of the following year, and that was when he died. So, namatay siya noong September. He was buried above ground because Mrs. Marcos wanted to bring President Marcos back to the Philippines for a proper burial. So September, October, November, again, December, January, February, March. March was when the trial was to start the following year. So yung mga kinikwento ko mga taong kasama namin, ando na sila. Many of them were already in Honolulu and they just flew to New York City, and March was the start of the trial. So ano nangyari nung namatay si President Marcos? Well, as I described this also, there are so many sad moments that I find difficulty talking about, but which I have to relay because these are episodes in that past that I don't think anybody has even talked about it or even written of it. But these are things which I hope those who are listening can be able to remember that this can be done to a president of an independent sovereign republic like the Philippines. And this was done by the most powerful country in the world. So, when President Marcos was in the morgue, kamamatay lang niya, nasa morgue siya for the embalming. And Mrs. Marcos approached his body and removed his wedding ring so that she could transfer that wedding ring to her finger. And she was there in prayer, in solitude, in silence by herself. Who arrived? Members of the Justice Department of the United States of America. Wala man lang kortesiya na let the widow grieve for, for a while. Right after kamamatay lang ng asawa, kalalagay lang sa morgue. Imelda Marcos, would you like to have either a medical, what do you call this, anong tawag dito, yung lowering the guilt so that they don't have to go to trial? I'm even losing the legal term for this. So, tinanong siya if she wanted that kind of an arrangement so that she doesn't have to go to trial anymore. Kasi ang talagang target nila was Ferdinand Marcos. Si Imelda parang sumabit lang kasi kasama ng syndicate daw. The government of the Republic of the Philippines was a syndicate. Asawa siya, kasama siya doon. And she answered, if you want me to admit that we stole $1 instead of all of those billions of money that went into those buildings, it is still the fact that we stole. I cannot do this. More than that, it's not, our honor is not subject to negotiation. I will proceed with the trial. So inofferan siya ng Justice Department ng United States of America. Pre-bargain. I finally found that term. Mag-plea bargain. Meaning, she will plea for a lesser crime so that they do not have to go to trial or i-archive na lang and siguro in time makakalimutan na. Pero nag-plea bargain na at sisistensyahan na siya doon sa pre-bargain na yon. A bargaining. Her plea will be bargained. Guilty, pero hindi na kailangan ikulong at hindi na kailangan mag-proceed sa trial. And that was where she rejected it. Right there at the morgue. Can you imagine that? Anyway, so, eto na. This is again, just so long as you would see some incidents that could be amusing in a way. So she did not know the lawyers who were handling the case of President Marcos at the time. Of course, she knew Lolong Lazaro, who was residing in Manila and who was the support staff here in Manila for the trial, but he was not there in New York. So yung mga, and besides, he could not represent President Marcos in New York kasi you have to be a member of the bar of New York City. So it was the three lawyers of President Marcos. So Imelda must have met several times, every time they would confer with President Marcos in Makiki kasi may opisina, may library si President Marcos doon, and almost every day ka-meeting niya yung mga lawyers. You had Richard Hybe, and then you had John Barco. They were lawyers from mainland, and they would fly to Honolulu, and yun na nga. And so Mrs. Marcos said she didn't feel comfortable with them because hindi naman niya talaga nakakausap. Ang nag-uusap sa kanila si President Marcos. So ang kanyang kaibigan noon, Doris Duke, the richest, wealthiest woman of the United American of America, was always there, especially nung na-widow na si Mrs. Marcos. She was there and she was very supportive. And so Mrs. Marcos looked at Doris and said, I'm not comfortable with the lawyers of President Marcos. But then, of course, the children said, you have to maintain them because they know the case and they have to assist. Pero sabi ni Mrs. Marcos, John Barco is up to her, up to here lang niya, hanggang dito lang. And ang kantangkat ni Mrs. Marcos, and you know how Mrs. Marcos, the choreographer, sabi niya, akit kami ng courthouse. Tapos yung abogado ko, parang mas kalahati lang ang height sa akin. Well, anyway, she was not comfortable, not because of what they looked like, but because she really did not have that kind of a repartee or conversation with them for the length of time that when the president was alive. Kasi hindi naman siya sinasali ni President Marcos. He tried to get her out of the worry and the anxieties of the cases. So sabi ni Doris Duke, okay, let's look for the best lawyers here in Honolulu, the best top criminal lawyers. And there was one name that was supposed to be the top, and that was a young man, Ben Cassidy. Naku, dumating siya doon sa bahay, naka-Porsche. Pasok siya. And so he discussed not discussed the case, but he discussed how he would proceed. So he said, what is important is I have to go to your country, to the Philippines, and you give me a list of people I can talk with so that I can be able to interview them and find out if they could be possible witnesses for the defense of Ferdinand Marcos. So I was assigned to meet with Ben Cassidy here in Manila, and then from the office of Lolong Lazaro, he was also assisting for the people that Ben Cassidy would be meeting and interviewing. And he went all the way up to Ilocos, as a matter of fact, para makausap yung mga tao na when he was a congressman, mayaman na talaga si Marcos. So he did not become rich only when he was president to be able to buy those buildings, because the Ilocanos there would know that even as he was congressman, ang gagara daw ng kanyang mga sasakyan. In fact, one of his old American cars was still there, parked in a garage. And that could be the best evidence that even as a congressman, he already had beautiful cars, top of the line, and he was already rich, as a matter of fact. So, mga ganon, bits and pieces that could be gathered for the defense of Ferdinand Marcos because of the trial in New York City. So yon. When Ben Cassidy returned to Honolulu, that's what he told Doris Duke. I cannot handle this case by myself. Sabi niya, it's such a big case that I cannot just, even if Doris Duke considered him as the best criminal lawyer in Honolulu, sabi niya, you have to look, Doris, for the best criminal lawyers in the entire United States of America. Yun. So that was the time they zeroed it down to about 3 or 4, I think, of the supposedly the top criminal lawyers in the entire United States of America. So nilatag yung kanilang mga retrato at katabi nun yung kanilang mga biodata. Doris Duke looked at them without even reading the biodata. Nakita niya yung picture ni Jerry Spence, cowboy, mahabang buhok, naka-cowboy hat, tapos yung kanyang, I don't know what you call it, yung mga frills dito sa kanyang cowboy outfit. Kaagad, tinuro ni Doris Duke, I like him. So yun, Jerry Spence. Jerry Spence was holding office and his law firm was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It's a small city in Wyoming. So tawag siya using her satellite phone. So Jerry Spence, this is Doris Duke. I'd like you to represent Imelda Marcos. Can I send my plane over to pick you up so that you could be meeting here, because there will be the trial already in New York City, etc., etc. And so Jerry Spence answered, well, I have to meet the client and I have to know what the case is all about, but don't bother to send your plane to get me. I am flying my own plane to Honolulu. And that's exactly what happened. And so then dumating si Jerry Spence, and here again, this is some kind of a sideline lang talaga, but very interesting. This gives you also an indication of what kind of a lawyer Jerry Spence was. And of course, Imelda, at her moment when she felt so lost, kamamatay lang ng asawa niya, wala siyang alam tungkol sa kaso niya, at eto may bagong abogado. So andun siya sa airport, dun sa private hangar, kung saan naglalanding yung mga private planes, dumating si Jerry Spence. And sinalubong niya, and they were walking, and then Jerry looked at her and said, my goodness, we are the same age, Mrs. Marcos. I researched already, ano na daw siya ng konting research, and pareho sila. They were the same age, but my goodness, you look so lovely and so young, and ganon. Sagot ni Mrs. Marcos, that is because I am innocent and my heart is pure. Ay nako, bagsak na yung loob ni Jerry Spence. But for instance, like all of those who are critical of Mrs. Marcos, and all of those who would say, napaka-corny naman ng kanyang sagot. But that's exactly what she said. I heard it, Jerry Spence heard it, looked at her, and just kept quiet and said, look at this woman. I'm telling her, I am flattering her because she's so lovely, she's so beautiful. And that's exactly what she said, because my heart is pure and I am innocent of all the charges, etc. And then Jerry pointed to, there was a woman who was crossing the street before they got to the car. Sabi niya, this is America. And look, there is no justice here in America. Wow. Imagine that was his first title. In fact, that's the title of one of his books. Justice for none, justice for all. So that's exactly what he said. By the time he rode the car, hindi pa nga napag-uusapan yung kaso, sinabi ni Jerry, I will represent you. So that was it. So yun na yung happening ngayon. And I'm sharing it with you kasi these are little incidents kung paano nakuha si Jerry Spence. Okay, so New York na. Malapit na kasing, malapit na matapos yung ating oras. So ito na sa New York, jury selection na, March yan. Namatay si President Marcos September of the previous year. Byuda na si Mrs. Marcos pagdating niya sa New York for the beginning of the official trial. And you know how it is, the justice system in America, meron jury. Ito na ang madugo, yung jury selection. Wow! This is where you could see that every time Jerry Spence would be choosing, among several na ito pwedeng jury member, kinakat down ng judge na hindi pwede, kinakat down ng prosecution na hindi pwede. Doon pa lang mararamdaman mo na talaga yung the heat against the Marcoses. In fact, doon lang nagsasagutan na because even Mrs. Marcos was shocked at the language that they were exclaiming to each other. Eto si judge shouting at Jerry, don't fucking my, I'm sorry to say it. And Jerry would answer just about in the same manner. And that was it. So even sa jury selection, ang init na ng pagpipili. And the prejudice, you could feel it. That kung, kasi sabi nga ni Jerry, let's look for somebody na pwede natin mag-consider na wala pang bias, na medyo siguro independent thinking, etc. Pero gano'n ang nangyari. In fact, after the jury selection, namili pa ng additional 6, the judge ordered for an additional 6 alternate members just in case any member of the jury na napili na at na-approve na ng judge, magkasakit o mamatay o may mangyari, meron kaagad alternate. At yung alternate, they had to attend. So we had 12 members of the jury plus 6. So 18 silang lahat na nakaupo doon sa tinatawag natin na jury box. And ang kinuha na chairperson, kasi kailangan merong parang, ang tawag dito, orchestra conductor. Yung chairperson was a paralegal in the law firm. Her name is Catherine Bolton. She was one of the first, actually, that I interviewed after the trial, after the acquittal of Mrs. Marcos. Anyway, so gano'n, nakita niyo kung gano'ng kadugo talaga. Doon pa lang sa jury selection. Tapos yung mga exchanges pa prior to the actual start of the trial, that was when, the judge himself was the one who brought it up. Oh, so now if you question why the prejudice, that I might be prejudiced because my wife, Diane Nicholson, is a classmate of Corazon Aquino. Wala ka nang masabi doon. Siya na naglabas na huwag kayong mabahala kasi I will rule according to the law and according to my court. And so, wag na niyong ilabas na yung aking asawa ay kaklase ni Corazon Aquino. Ang cute, and I personally, when I was hearing this, didn't even know that. I did not even go as far as researching the family and the wife of John F. Keenan. Ang na-research ko lang, yung kanyang pagsentensya. Kung meron tayong Justice Pamaran dito na tinatawag nating hanging judge, ayan ang reputation ni Judge F. Keenan dun sa Southern District ng New York City. So, siya na naglabas noon. So, wag na kayong mag-question pa, wag na niyong tanungin pa. It doesn't matter if my wife is the classmate of Corazon Aquino. Wow. Now, what am I really trying to say here is that ang dami talagang mga circumstances that were revolving around that time. So, kaya nga sabi ko, ikikwento ko, let's take a break. Because ang pinakamahalaga dito ay isipin ninyo, the most powerful country in the world can file or filed a criminal case against the president of a sovereign republic for violating an American law which involves criminal syndicates, thereby alleging that the Philippine government was a criminal syndicate under Ferdinand Marcos. That was how serious, how heavy, how I don't know what other adjective I could use to describe that particular case. Akala nyo, basta kaso-kaso lang, Rico-Rico case, ganun kabigat. You look at the United States of America today. Look at what they have done over the past 75 years since the last World War, when the world was now divided into communism and democracy, into states that were aligned with America and the states aligned with the communists. And who was President Marcos? The friend of 5 American presidents, an ally of America. Can you imagine that? Despite the fact na ganun ka, and my goodness, he practically almost adored these American soldiers with whom, sabi nga niya, our blood commingled in the battlefields of our country. That was his speech to the American Congress. Anong nangyari? Bakit nagkaganon? Bakit? Because they wanted the American bases to stay here. And Marcos reduced their staying here from 99 years to 25 years to 5 years. Yan ang pinakamasakit sa kanila. The American bases, the biggest military bases outside the mainland, Clark Air Force Base of their American planes and whatever else they had there, and the Subic Naval Base of their naval ships, their submarines, their aircraft carriers, etc. Yan ang mahalaga sa kanila. At doon sila natakot na yung bases na yan na pinakialaman ni Marcos na i-reduce yung kanilang term of occupancy plus several other provisions na talagang pinagsakit ng loob nila. That was their interest. Look at how this is the pattern that they have done for the past 75 years in practically every country that they have invaded, that they have declared war against, and of course what has happened since then. Vietnam is a very clear example. Gaano katagal yung Vietnam War? Mabot ng more than 10 years. 18, sabi nga nila. And America had to withdraw. Natalo sila sa Vietnam, but they would not say na nag-withdraw sila or they surrendered. They just left. Hindi nila nakaya. Because that was a surrogate war between America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, between America and the Soviets. What was the Korean War? Ganun din in the 1950s. Hindi nila nakuha ang North Korea. So they had to break it into the North and South Korea and the 38 parallel dividing countries. What happened in Afghanistan? Kasi andun ang mga Ruso, pumasok sila. Anong itsura ng Afghanistan ngayon? Anong interest sa Afghanistan? Opium. Anong interest dyan sa Panama Canal? The Panama Canal, which have been turned over already to Panama under the term of Noriega. O tinanggal nila sa Noriega kasi meron isang Amerikanong namatay, nilusog nila ang Panama, hinuli si Noriega, and became the American prisoner. Read his book. What happened in Iraq? Ganon din. What happened in Libya? Exactly. That is the power and the might of the most powerful country in the world, the United States of America, and that was exactly what we heard every day of the trial in New York City when Mary, the court secretary, would bang the door before the judge would enter and say, "All rise, United States of America versus Imelda Romualdez Marcos." When I first heard that, I wept for our country. In fact, one of the writers of the broadsheets, the local newspapers in New York City, yun nga ang sinabi, 2 exotic figures enter the New York courthouse. The Egyptian Adnan Khashoggi and the Filipina Imelda Romualdez Marcos. What are these 2 foreigners doing in an American court? Ayan. It was a question raised, I'm just quoting, from one of the editorials of one of the broadsheets in New York City. And in the column of Cindy Adams, ito yung parang nagsusulat lang tungkol sa mga artista, sa mga celebrities, sa mga happenings sa New York. Napakaseryoso ng kanyang sinulat doon. Enough na. You know, enough of the torturing that you're doing to Imelda Marcos. Siya nagsulat noon, Cindy Adams. Anyway, so what am I trying to say? In the midst of all of this, that was the past that I am bringing to the present so that we will realize what we are facing in the future. You have the Secretary of Defense of America now under Biden, and he has come to meet with the officials of South Korea and of Japan kasi andun ang American forces nila sa South Korea at sa Japan, andun ang kanilang mga aircraft carrier, yung kanilang mga war material, andun yun. Binaypass tayo dito sa Pilipinas. You see? Tingnan ninyo ang galaw na yan. Obama said, ang pivot here is in Asia. Alam nila how critical our country is. They've done it before with Ferdinand Marcos. God forbid that they will interfere again now because they've already interfered quite physically with 5 American bases located in 5 Philippine bases. So remember that. This is geopolitics. But I don't want to be very heavy on that. I just want to say, let's take a break. And that is the reason why I've done my best to gather these episodes of that particular trial in New York City because of that photograph of Willie Avila and myself in front of the district court in New York City. And a lot of people commented on it. Thank you for the flattery that you were saying I look good in that photograph. But believe me, it was such a difficult period in the life of our own country, and most especially in the life of Imelda Romualdez Marcos. Episodes which perhaps I bring back every once in a while for us to realize that in this world, these are the movements of people, of governments, of heads of state, and we have to be very careful to maintain the independence of our sovereignty, and that we can stand on our own against all of these tentacles of influence coming from the outside and weaving in. Can we avoid this? No, we can't. Can we be able to deflect them? No, we can't. But we can gather strength among ourselves to be united at this particular stage. We can't even be united with our pronouncements regarding this COVID virus and so forth. So let us be united as far as our integrity as a people is concerned. And these episodes that I am bringing back and forth to is for us to realize that once upon a time, the most powerful country in the world was able to do this to one of the finest and greatest leaders that we have here in the Southeast Asian region, Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, survived by his wife, who perhaps, I hope she listens to this, continues to have moments of memory, beautiful as they may be, but also moments of sufferance. So, thank you for having joined me. Now, let's see my chat. Oh dear. We have Tony de la Peña, Arsenal, gandang hapon po. Hope you remember me. Yes, of course. Do I remember? If I can remember, my dear Tony de la Peña, Arsenal, if I can remember 55 years ago, 1965, of course I can remember. Rosalinda Cabanilla, Ma'am Rita, nice hearing you, watching you again, always watching your blog. May God bless you. Thank you very much for your blessings. Magandang araw po, ma'am. This is from Moods Kerubin. Saan na po patungo ang ating bansa? Eto na. We will discuss where we're going in the next episode, etc. So 2022, perhaps we'll discuss elections much later. I dread to think of all of these faces and names that I'm reading now. So, okay, running time is already 1 hour, but before we close, we really have to do this moment to moment. Dear God, walk with us through this season of a pandemic. Open our hearts to your wisdom, O Lord, and give us the strength to share your love with others. Through this time of uncertainty, may we look at each day as a celebration of your greatness and make us ready to share your mercy and your love to everyone. Amen. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi, and this has been your hour.